Hey, welcome back. I'm Angie, and I'm also grateful because, as always, each guest on this show brings such a unique presence. This week we have Larkhall. Larkhall performs piano with these live visuals that are in sync with his music, making his performances not like any other. We discuss the toxicity of music school and touch on the topic of vulnerability in regards to learning to sing. We dive into the topic of performing, particularly how often we misperceive a mistake for a bad performance. Not the same thing. Finally, for all you parents listening out there, we talk about how Larkhall's children play an influence in his music and mental health and the impact on his creativity. You could find his music on all streaming services by searching his name the way you see it in this episode. Enjoy!
Hello.
Hi, how are you?
Hey, yeah, pretty good. Very summery weather here.
Oh, nice.
Which is, nice, but I'm sort of up on this mezzanine, so it gets very warm up
Where
here.
are you located right now?
I'm in Bath in the UK, which is
very beautiful. Nice.
Yeah, it's a beautiful sort of countryside area. It's not like hip and happening so much, but it's close to Bristol and London, so
that's really cool.
Things happen there.
I've been all around England for one summer and it was like so beautiful. I loved it.
I don't know. Yeah, there's something about the climate and countryside and all of that I feel like it's what, like, in North America we sort of think of as the countryside, even though most North American countryside doesn't look like that.
That's so nice, though. I must say, very, very beautiful, very different from Toronto, which is where I am.
Yeah, I mean, I like Toronto, but it's not countryside.
No, it's the furthest thing from that. Definitely. It's more New York than it is country. I would love for you to kind of introduce yourself. Usually I would introduce the artists on this show, but you have such a creative twist to your artistry. And I would love to hear how you combine, visual elements to music.
Sure. Yes. So I'm Larkhall. I perform piano music with live visuals, and I've built a system that can listen to my performance and create visuals in real time as I play. So I can play, a little bit faster or slower, the way that a musician reacts in, to the specifics of the moment. And the visuals follow. The unique thing about it is that the system also understands what's musically important in what I'm playing. So it can tell the difference between a melody note and an accompaniment figure, or what's a bass note, or when a section changes, and then the visuals can change in response to that as well.
That's really cool. How did you come up with this idea, and how did you make it happen?
Yeah, it's been a development process for a while. I think it started when I was recording my 2019 album, which I recorded at home, and I have a piano that has these sensors built in, so you can get like MIDI data. You can kind of get the notes that you played back, in addition to the sound that comes out of the piano. So I recorded that, not really knowing exactly what I wanted to do with it. I just, I had this album recorded, and then I had this data, and I started playing around with ways of visualizing it. And it just grew into this system of these live visuals. And at first they were all based on pre-recorded data, but I thought, well, I need to be able to do this live. So I built a kind of data pipeline thing so that I could, do it off of just a normal acoustic piano. It doesn't have to have any special sensors. And
wow.
And the algorithm can tell where I am in a piece, partially because it has a version of the score. So I have like a machine readable version of the score. So it's not just, the computer isn't just sort of listening blind saying, oh, I think that's a G and E flat. But it knows sort of, oh, the next thing that is meant to happen in the piece is this chord, and can just say, like, has it happened yet? And okay, it's happened. What's the next event? And that is a lot more computationally possible to do, especially in real time, than just sort of asking a computer like, oh, what notes am I playing? That's because you can play so many different notes on a piano, and often very quickly. It's really difficult to identify them accurately if you don't have that hint, but then with that hint, the algorithm can be pretty accurate.
That is so cool. That is like so creative.
Thanks.
It kind of reminds me of, have you ever heard of synesthesia?
Yeah. A lot of times people ask me if I have synesthesia, and I very much don't.
Oh.
And in a sense, I think that's kind of what not what makes me able to do this, but I think that's because I don't have any specific visual response to what I'm hearing. I have a sort of blank slate to make any mapping between it. And I think because I've known some people with synesthesia, I think anytime someone has a kind of special thing like that, you get a little bit jealous. And I think I probably thought, oh, what could I do that's kind of like that?
No, it's really cool. I wonder if you've ever gotten like reactions from folks with synesthesia. Like, how did they react? Like, would the colors match up to what they saw? Would it like conflict with what they saw and like create like a dissonance? How would they react? Do you know?
Yeah, I don't know. I imagine because different people with synesthesia have different assignments between colors and sounds and letters and numbers. And so I imagine for someone, it could be that, oh, wow, that piece has the colors that the sounds have, or it could be, oh, no, those are totally wrong. But I guess, one thing that I've heard is that if you do combine the sort of the right color with a certain pitch, for example, that for the people that I've talked to, there isn't this sense of like, yes, there's just a sense of like, oh, well, it was there already. Like it was that E flat was already yellow. So the fact that you put yellow with it is like, fine. But it's like if someone was wearing two name tags, like we don't really, you don't need the second one. It's like, oh, it's yellow. So it might be more interesting to them if the colors that I used were like nicely harmonious, like made good color combinations with the ones that they saw. I have no idea. This is all speculating based on.
Of course. Yeah, I can only speculate too. And for those who don't know what synesthesia is, it's basically associating colors with different sounds, letters, numbers. So that's why there's just such a similarity between creating music and, visual effects and art with that music, which makes it so interesting. So now kind of like, I wish there was like a synesthetic person in this conversation who could like comment on this. But in any case, you've been playing instruments for a really long time and you started off with piano, and I read your story on your website. And I just want to say, like, the way you romanticize your love for piano and music in general, but particularly piano, is not only relatable, but just so beautiful. Like it's like told in such like a cinematic way. It's so beautiful.
That's lovely to hear.
Yeah. So you did mention how your first love was piano, right? So me too. And I've said this numerous times on my I've said this too many times on my podcast, actually, how like, piano for me was my first love, and failing my 10th level of the Conservatory of Music here in Canada was my first heartbreak. So I'm curious to hear if music and piano was your first love, what was your first heartbreak when it came to music?
That's really interesting. I always used to say in America, we don't have grades like that. Like I moved to the UK and that was kind of the first time I heard about the kind of grade system. I think they maybe exist in America, but it was not something that I ever knew about growing up or heard about. And yeah, I can imagine if there had been that kind of like national graded system, it really puts a frame around your musical growth that I think isn't helpful. I think there can be helpful ways to engage with it, but not the way that I generally see people doing it. The thing, because I've thought about this a lot since moving to the UK and hearing a lot about the grade system. And to me, it feels like the grade system, the way to interact with it is not that you work and work and work and then get your grade 1, and then you work and work and work and get your grade 2. It's that you play music and you think, well, I could obviously get a grade 1, and you just go get your grade 1 one day and you don't really think about it too much because it's super easy, right? And you're actually playing at whatever we would, you'd think of as a grade 3 or 4 or something level. And you can just kind of go in and it's just this kind of, just a thing you do one afternoon with obviously maybe a little bit of prep, but that it isn't this focus of a year or more of preparation, because that's not what music's for.
Yeah, no, you're right. How could you put a grade on music? How could you put a grade on anything? Honestly, I have a lot of bones to pick with the grading systems all over.
Yeah. And and I think obviously if you're doing a competition or you are, auditioning for like an orchestra spot or something, there are times when you have to pick one person or a couple of people out of a field of applicants. And of course, there's going to be assessment in that situation. But when you're growing up playing music, there's so much potential for social music making and for music to just be part of your life in a way that can just really bring you joy and connection with other people and carry on into adulthood in a way that, just like working by yourself in a room to get a grade is like not. Anyway, that's a tangent because I didn't do any of that growing up. I think in terms of heartbreak, I think there was a little bit of heartbreak when I first got to uni and sort of realized that my background did not line up with the background of the sort of person who normally goes to get a classical piano degree. I remember there was one guy, so this is in freshman entering class, and this guy he's from New York City. He'd done Juilliard pre-college. He'd been playing chamber music at Juilliard since he was like 8. And he just knew the repertoire, and he had this advanced sense of musicality that was like so refined. And I was really jealous of that because it was like, well, I don't have that, but there's no way in the middle of nowhere growing up that I could have gotten that. I mean, there are ways of becoming musical, but there's not a way to get that pedigree unless you happen to be in that location. And so I worked really, really, really hard to try to level up. And I spent quite a few years practicing, probably more than I should have, to try to, catch up to that. And in a sense I did. And also in a sense, like I could have gone and had fun a little bit more. I think that I didn't really appreciate how much that like university experience is pretty short, and you don't get that again. You can obviously you can always go back to school and study, but you never get that experience of being, a really young adult with all these other people who are doing the same thing. And there's just like a freshness to that I think just engaging more with other people would have been good. And even if it cost me sort of 3% of my piano technique, it would have probably been worthwhile. So that was kind of I haven't thought about it in terms of heartbreak specifically, but it was definitely a difficult time.
One that obviously very much so stood out to you. And I think it's like a very, very common sentiment that you just echoed, basically saying that like, well, he has this, why don't I? I feel like that's like really common in the artist community, especially because, we compare genres so much, we compare artists so much, we dehumanize artists and celebrities and singers. So it's like to say, oh, they have something I don't. Well, objectively, you have something that most, if not all artists don't, you have like your twist to it that other people, particularly this fellow that you were talking about, can say that he definitely doesn't have, unless they were inspired by your work and have decided to create something of similar like. So I must say, definitely a very, very similar sentiment. Like I felt it as well. And I think it really comes from imposter syndrome and not being able to realize like how much we do have and how far we have come, and like realizing that we don't have to be this person or that person, and that who we are is exactly, it's the destination. It's exactly where we're supposed to be and who we are.
There's a real importance in developing yourself and your voice as a music creator. And I think he was playing this this beautiful Mozart, and I wanted that. Like in the moment I was like, oh, I want to play beautiful Mozart, but like that's not my thing. Like obviously I would love to be able to play beautiful Mozart and speak Chinese and like any other number of things, but like the things that I'm actually going to devote time to in my life are not becoming a professional level Mozart interpreter. That's just not my thing. And so thinking about it in terms of like what really fits me it lets me then like not begrudge him being this amazing like Mozart interpreter. It's just cool. You found this thing. You're great at it. Amazing. You're great at this thing.
Yeah.
And so I think digging a little bit deeper, the thing was really like, not like, oh, I specifically want to play Mozart, but like, I don't know what my thing is. Right. And that's like a more personal kind of like, oh, I have to really figure that out.
So how did you figure it out?
Well, what my thing was, I think it's always it's always like an approximation. Like people talk about scientific theories as being like, they're never right. They're useful
right until they're wrong,
and they become more and more accurate. Right. Yeah. Maybe that's just comparison that only makes sense in my head. But I think what I did at first was play a lot of new music. That was something that fit with me. So I was playing music by living composers. I was starting to write music. And I found some success with that, but it wasn't really a perfect fit. I have some issues with the way that the new music world it kind of focused, I think, too much on what I see it as is trauma from the Second World War that essentially has been crystallized into performance practice and compositional practice, and that's sort of why music has to sound that way.
Wait, can you explain this?
Yeah. Well, sure. So I should preface this all by saying that I think that the new music community has really moved on in the last 10 years. And I'm seeing a lot of really exciting stuff and things that feel like we've kind of digested that era and are starting to move on from it. I think that maybe could have happened 50 years before, and we could have had a lot more, less aversive music. And I, again, I think that there's a place for that. I really like some music that is some work to listen to. But I think that the way that academic music and sort of experimental music has been set up is that it has to be a certain amount, aversive and experimental and boundary pushing and using weird pitch collections and things like that, or else it's not serious. And I think, so the thing about trauma is that essentially after the Second World War, there were a lot of composers who understandably had a very traumatic time and wanted to express this in their music, and they wrote a lot of music that was really expressing this, or attempting to express this kind of inexpressible horror and trauma. But then at the same time, things like the Marshall Plan came in and gave a bunch of composers in Europe, and particularly Germany, this kind of institutional platform to produce their music without really having to connect with an audience. And this is where we get the disconnect between what people want to hear and what composers are composing. And this is all very kind of broad strokes. There have been disconnects before, and people don't always, the composers aren't kind of always like pushed around by market forces. There have been lots of times when that hasn't really been the case. But what I see this as is kind of taking that traumatic period and turning it into an aesthetic in a way that then people, if you have tenure and you're a professor and you're teaching students, and then you kind of inculcate this way of music sounding into them, and it just becomes the way academic music sounds. And there was this really long period, I think, from the 50s through the 80s or 90s, where some people were doing really different things and some things were changing in music, but there was a kind of standard center, I think, to academic music that didn't move very much. And I think it kind of comes down to that. So I'm probably making some academic music people really mad by saying that, to which I can only say sorry. But there's been, even when I was in university, you'd see composers and performers saying, they really wanted to be, they were influenced by popular music and people wanting to kind of bridge this divide. And it felt very self-conscious and a little bit sort of reachy at the time. And the thing that I've seen now more recently is it feels like um, there's a much more natural connection. You have people who've actually grown up doing both things and have merged them, and it feels like the two musics actually are starting to touch, which is exciting because that's where I want to be. I have this real classical sensibility and background, but I'm also like not your kind of, you know, purebred classicalist. I've played in bands and I've just come up from outside the classical tradition as well.
Yeah.
And so the more that there's this like overlap between the two worlds, I'm really excited because I feel like that's where I live, and seeing other people be there is really exciting.
Yeah, it sounds really interesting, you know, bringing in generational trauma, historical trauma, and seeing how it plays a role in the upbringing of music. Yeah, it's so interesting. I grew up on classical. I was in the Royal Conservatory of Music here in Canada, which again, recently found out that is just known to Canada. But so I grew up on classical music, and I can definitely see what you're talking about, especially when I took, you know, like the history of music and all. But that being said, in terms of classical music, I remember growing up and hating that I was playing Mozart and Beethoven and Bach. And I was like, oh, first of all, I can't bring a piano to a campfire. I can't play, like, no one can sing to freaking, whatever song I can't think of right at the top of my head right now. But like, I hated that. The fact that I felt like my community, this is like really weird, but this was my sentiment when I was like 10 years old, 11 years old. But my community was not my age. My community was people older than me, because I felt classical music was specifically for older generations, older people. And you can't sing along to it. It's not fun. And, you know, like, though it might be objectively pretty and impressive, it's like, okay, that's kind of where it ends. And I hated that. I hated that I couldn't build a community, my community, from that base. But hearing, you know, you say you wish you could play Mozart and, you know, XYZ, that's really interesting for me to hear, because I just recently started feeling that way, where I started embracing the fact that I grew up on classical music and loving classical music and like repeating some of the songs that I played years ago. So I don't know, what are your thoughts on that? You know, cool versus not cool instruments and pieces.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many different social contexts that music happens in, and different uses that we put music to. And, you know, I mean, the role of the piano as a courtship instrument, right? That was like such a, you know, thinking of social uses that music had. I mean, that was a big reason why there was a piano in every home in the kind of late 19th, early 20th century. And yeah, very much not a courtship instrument today. We don't sort of do courtship in the same way. And, you know, if there is one, it's probably gone back to being the guitar, you know, instrument of seduction. You can carry it under someone's window, etc. You know, which has been the kind of courtship instrument since it was the lute. So yeah, I think there are ways, well, going back for a second to like overlaps between different things. One of the things that really helped me musically was singing, and specifically singing in the sacred harp tradition, which, if you're not familiar, if listeners aren't familiar, is a a cappella singing tradition that grew out of English four-part singing, but it developed in the American South and East in the 17 and 1800s mostly. And so it's a notated music tradition, but it was developed in communities where a lot of the people singing it couldn't read, let alone read music. And so there's this system of shaped note heads that let people learn to read very easily and quickly. So the note heads are shaped differently depending on the function of the note. And it all sounds kind of heady, but then the way you learn it is actually you just sit down, you kind of hear the songs for a while and go, oh, I don't know what's going on. And then you start to go, oh, no, I recognize this one. I'm going to try singing along with this. And there were so many things that really were a great match for me in terms of that community. I mean, one was just community. Two, I didn't have a great connection with voice, and I think that's really important for a musician in general, especially when you're writing music or interpreting music, really. And so to be able to build that in a way where there's no director, no one's in charge. So you're sitting in a square, so all the parts are facing each other, and nobody's in charge, and there's no performances. Like that thing that you get together to do is the thing. You're not rehearsing for something. That is the thing. And so someone will just get up and say 271, and then everybody sings 271 one time, and then someone else gets up and they're like 80, 84, and then you sing 84 one time. So sometimes it goes well, sometimes it doesn't go as well, but like there's also not this thing of like, start from bar 20, let's try to make this bit better this time. It's like, there's none of that. You're just making music together, and some people get stuff spectacularly wrong, and that's fine. Everybody's trying to be as good as they can, but nobody's ever going to say, oh, you did that wrong.
Wow.
So
a
that
lot of freedom.
Yeah. And it's really, so the thing that struck me about that in relation to what you were saying is that it's this overlap between classical-ish music, right? It comes from this notated tradition. You have a book, you're singing out of a book, and a social music tradition where, nobody's saying you're doing something wrong. You're just getting together and singing, and it's not something that you need training to get into. You can just turn up and learn it through that kind of microculture of just being there and hearing the songs. And so finding things like that and creating things like that, I think, is really important for music generally, because we don't have the same kind of social music making that we did 100 years ago. And I think it's really important to have that and to nurture those.
Yeah, you're really getting rid of, there's no coloring within the lines because there's really very limited lines to color within. So I feel like that really, really, really emphasizes and develops your ability to think more freely, think outside of the box, challenge yourself in ways that you wouldn't be challenged when it comes to reading specific notes and playing in a specific way.
And I mean, like all folk musics, there are right and wrong ways of doing things. So there are things that you do that aren't necessarily notated, but you pick them up by being part of the community, right? And so,
cool.
You're not going to get yelled at for not doing them, but at some point someone might sort of politely explain, oh, there's, I don't know, there's a slight swing. It's not as much of a swing as sort of, like a triplet rhythm. It's just this really light thing. It almost just comes from accenting certain notes.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like you feel really passionately about singing and using your voice, but your music doesn't use too much of your voice.
Well, there's a few things. I think developing my voice to a certain level let me let go of that. I really did feel like I needed to sing. There was a whole phase of my musicianship where I was doing kind of singer-songwritery stuff. And I was never happy with that, and it never felt like a good fit. But it wasn't really until I got so that I felt good about singing that I could say, oh, I don't have to do this. I can just focus on the thing that I actually have real skill at, which is piano.
Well, why did you feel
I think the other, I don't know. I think it maybe comes down to wanting to make a connection with an audience and feeling like that's a sort of music that really connects with people. It's a way of representing music to people and just being a performer. That I think there's ways of being a solo instrumentalist performer and really connecting with an audience. But I think as a younger person, I was like, well, singing and playing piano, that's got to be the way. It's a sort of more standard way of doing it. And I think it took me a little while to realize that that standard way wasn't the way for me to do it.
Okay. Yeah. And that's really reasonable. If it's not for you, it's not for you. If you don't like it, then you don't like it. I mean, I've definitely felt very similar ways growing up. I'm currently in my, I need to learn how to sing phase.
Okay.
And I've always wanted to learn how to sing, but I've always felt like I never had a voice that was really good for singing. But that being said, even that, challenging that thought, what does a good singing voice entail? Because even, if I'm hitting the right key or whatever, I still feel, my voice is just not good enough. Because objectively, I think that singing is another form of vulnerability.
It's so personal, and it is really vulnerable. And it's just, that was one of the things that I realized is, I really like singing in this context, but like, I don't nobody's ever going to be, oh wow, he has this amazing voice, right? That's just like, different people have different skills, and that's, or I think it's there's a vulnerability to singing because it is like, you are the instrument, right? Like if I'm playing a bad piano, like that can be a separate thing to me playing piano badly, right? But if you are singing, you can be singing badly, or just someone cannot really like the way your voice works, and it's really hard to unpick those things.
That's like a really great way you framed that. I was like trying to wonder, what is it about? Because playing piano for me is very vulnerable as well. I think that instruments tell an amazing story. I think instruments can tell a story just as much as a voice can. But I couldn't understand, why is singing so different than playing an instrument? But I guess, you framed it very well. I consider my piano an extension of my body, but it's an extension. It doesn't necessarily I wasn't born with it.
Yeah, you can go play a different piano. You can't go sing a different voice.
Yes, exactly. So it's like you're stuck with your voice. But then again, I think that music is really subjective. And, if one person doesn't like one voice, it's not to say that everyone doesn't like that voice.
Yeah, well, there are lots of brilliant voices that are definitely not for everyone. I mean, I remember hearing Joanna Newsom when Joanna Newsom was first, getting big, and people were just like, what is this? And it took me, she's one of my favorite artists, but it took me a few goes to really start to be like, oh, I like this, versus just like, this is a super weird voice that this person is singing with.
Yes.
Bjork has a really weird voice, and loads of people love her voice. There are loads of ways where someone has a unique voice and just sell it, and they find connection with an audience. And I think a big part of that is you can tell that they are comfortable with their voice. They're not apologizing for their voice.
Yes.
They're not kind of trying to squeeze it into a different box. They're just like going for it. And that's,
I was right about to say, it's about like loving your voice. If you love it, then chances are, you're emulating confidence, and other people will see it, hear it, and love it too.
Yeah. Well, and I think this is the thing that exists in instrumental performance too, but like so many things, it's easier to see with voice because it is the person, and we all have a voice. We don't all have a piano or a clarinet, but I think there's a similar thing where if you can really take your strengths and just go for them and not be sort of apologizing for not being Horowitz or whoever, and there's so many little subtle physical ways that people can do that on stage. But if you're just having fun, I think that really comes across, and in everything you're doing. So I've seen some amazing performers do this recently, so I'm like really excited by this idea.
Well, what about you? Do you feel that you've reached the level of being unapologetic about your art?
Yeah, I think that's happened over lockdown, actually. There was a thing. So I've always enjoyed performing, but I think there was a tension that I was holding where I was performing, and I was kind of always thinking about how well the performance was going, kind of not letting myself really love it. And over the lockdowns, I did live streams from my house, and there was something about being at home that was really relaxing. But it is a performance. There are people on the other end of that internet camera line, whatever it is. And so you have to have that focus of a performance, and it gave me access to this place where I could leave more space, and I could just have fun with things. And I noticed that in the performances, and became more and more aware of that as I continued to do the live streams. And that's something that I've then been able to bring into live performance, which is really exciting. So I played a show a few months ago in Exeter, and just walking out and just being like, let's have some fun, and just like playing this stuff. And things like, because I have this very technical setup, there's always the chance that something will not work in the technology, just like there's always the chance that you'll play a wrong note or something, right?
Yeah.
And then when that happens, not sort of being like, oh God, how do I, but just like, oh, okay, that's happened.
It happened.
Yeah, I'm gonna fix it this way, and kind of going for that without any like fear or apology, really, just like, oh no, we're gonna do that. And I think there's a way of thinking about it that comes from meditation, which is this idea of a kind of relaxed curiosity. which is what I always try
Oh,
to get before I go out on stage, is not sort of saying, oh, this has to be a good show, or I hope this is a good show, but just, oh, and not even you getting away from just, oh, a good show, but just, oh, I wonder what this show is going to be. Like, this is the only
yeah.
time that I will ever be about to play this show. And I'm really curious about how it's going to go.
Yeah. And what makes a show good versus bad? Because it can't be the mistakes. Because I mean, I remember when I was like, this is honestly maybe one of my more prouder moments. I remember when I was 15 and I was performing on the piano, and there was a part where I completely forgot what it was. And I went from a major key to a minor key, and it just shifted the entire piece. I didn't even know what notes I was playing anymore at that point. I just improvised. And then I, at some point went back to continuing on the right track. So afterwards, no one, not a single person noticed. Everyone was, applauding, and like my friends and family were telling me, that was so beautiful, that was so great. My piano teacher was like, what was that? Because she obviously heard. She was like, I'm so confused as to what just happened. What? I would not, even though that was a mistake, I wouldn't consider that a bad performance. So like mistakes don't make a performance good or bad, or a show good or bad. So I'm curious, what makes a show good versus what makes a show bad?
I think it's down to connecting with the audience and showing the audience something. I think if there are people there who have an experience of, who feel something, then that feels like a great show to me. And there can be degrees of that. There can be loads of people who have an amazing time, or 5 people who have an amazing time, or whatever. But it's I think, that feeling where because you sense the audience, and there can be a moment where you're playing and you kind of feel the audience go, oh, and whatever that oh is, that's like, oh, yeah, okay, this is now it's happening right now. I'm showing them something.
Yeah.
And so that's I think that's a moment that I look for when I'm playing.
That's amazing. Making connections. I think that is always a huge goal of an artist, connect with their audience. And even if they can't see an audience, like during the pandemic, it was difficult to visually see an audience. Maybe you're not getting comments from every single person who's watching, but if they're watching, especially during a pandemic, if they're watching, they're choosing to be there, whether it's one person or a million people, it doesn't matter. It's just like, even connecting with one person, one viewer, one listener is such a beautiful experience. And that experience can be also recreated from just the comfort of your bedroom when no one's listening at all. You're connecting with yourself. And I think that's also a really, really great practice. Every time you sit down to play, connect with yourself, connect with your instrument, and put on a show for yourself. I think that just really helps you connect with your music.
Yeah.
So
yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Who's to say that the audience is the only audience? You're also an audience. But I know that you have kids, right?
I do. Yes.
Yes. So I don't get the opportunity to talk to a lot of artists who have families. And I'm really curious as to how, because I can only talk about how my family has played a role, my sisters and my parents, but not the family that I've created. So I'm curious as to how your family plays a role in your music.
Yeah, so I have a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old, and it is challenging to find time to be creative while parenting. The 4 and 6 is much easier than sort of 2 and 4, or 0 and 2. There's definitely a bit of a pause in the creative output. When they're very small and just need you all the time. They can be really inspiring because they see everything fresh, and you have to be in the moment with kids. If you're always thinking like, what's the point of this, or where are we going with this, like, they're not thinking any of that. They just want to build something with their Lego, or they want to draw this picture, and for them it's very much about just like enjoying what's happening right now, and not being attached to, are we working towards some big project that we can show other people, right? That's kind of the adult
something
life.
We can learn from kids, though.
For sure. And so I found that's something that I've had to develop, and that I've kind of been a bit dragged into kicking and screaming, because it's not something that comes naturally to me. But it's something I'm really grateful for. And they also, I mean, they can just be a great audience where I'll show them some visuals that I'm making and they'll be like, that's great. Or like, they'll get kind of bored and wander off. And it's like, you know, I mean, 4 and 6 is not my like central of my target audience really for my shows mostly, but it's great to just get an unfiltered reaction to something that you're making, whether it's the visuals or the piano. You know, you play something and you just get this really just a different response to it, to what, you know, what an adult would give you.
So do you think your music inspires them to pursue and love music just as much as you?
They definitely have music in their lives. I mean, they'll be singing any of the sort of family music, just things that we have on, you know, they'll be singing it and doing it. There's an interesting thing. So they both play cello. So my partner's a violist and sings. And so we wanted them to play an instrument that neither one of us played.
Cool.
But because we both play string instruments, we kind of get the cello in a way that, you know, it's, so I think because we both play music professionally, they kind of assume that it's easy. And there's a certain amount of, you know, they'll do it, but they don't really feel like that because they've not seen the period where we've had to really, really work to be able to do this. I can just sort of pick up a cello and play the things that they're playing. And so I wonder about that, if they will need to kind of have a realization that, oh, this isn't something that you just can do. Like it can become a very natural thing, but it is also something that you have to spend a lot of time learning. There's just so many aspects to it, or there's so many. I remember I used to teach piano and thinking about component skills, right? That you have to be able to have your hands in this position and your fingers have to be independent and you have to be able to have this control. And then you can do this other thing that we call legato or whatever, right? And it's, you know, and then once you have legato, you can do this, you know, sort of more complex phrasing, and you just build up all these bigger and bigger component skills. That just takes a lot of time.
It does. And I have so many of my piano students, you know, they're like, well, why can't I do that? Like, why can't I play that quick? Or why can't I play like this person? And it's honestly, music does not happen overnight. I feel like, dare I say, learning an instrument is probably one of the biggest commitments you're going to have to make to truly learn an instrument, because I've been playing since I was 4. I'm now 23 and I'm still learning about the piano and learning new techniques constantly.
Yeah. I think that's a thing that we have really absorbed as, you know, you get to a certain stage in music and you understand that you're always learning and you're never done. But I remember there was a piano student. It was a dad had brought in his son for a lesson, and he was asking me some questions, you know, about practicing and things. And then he said, well, when will he be done? And I was like, excuse me, what? He's like, well, how long is it going to, like, when is he going to know how to play? You know, he'll be finished with lessons because he knows how to play the piano. And I was like, well, that's just not how it works. Like, you know, you could take a year's worth of lessons or 10 years of lessons or 30 years worth of lessons. And, you know, I mean, there is a point at which you become self-sufficient. And that can happen at different stages. And, you know, you continue learning more and more on your own. And then you learn from kind of more peers and mentors rather than, you know, going in for a lesson and saying, how do I do this? But yeah, you keep growing forever. And he did not like that answer. So I don't think that kid came back. But I think I was sad for, because it's just, you know, it was a mental shift that he just couldn't. I mean, maybe he did it later, but in that particular lesson, he wasn't able to do it.
Yeah. I mean, I understand it, you know, growing up. Obviously there was moments where I was like, well, I just want to be able to do this now. But I also feel like personally, and I'm going to hit on depression now, but personally, I've gone through a lot of depression, and coming back to an instrument that I can objectively see getting better over time, even if I'm still making mistakes in the moment, maybe in the short term, it's like, oh my God, like I played I played this piece worse today than I did yesterday. Okay, that happens. That can be a little bit discouraging, but in the long term, it's like, I can play this piece, and last year I would not have been able to play this piece.
Yeah.
And so coming back to something that has always been there for me, and something that I can turn to and practice and know that, this is in my control, that really, really helped me feel like I had a security blanket around me.
Yeah. And I think, being part of the classical music tradition, you're part of something bigger than yourself, and that's one of the things that brings meaning to our lives. So that can be really meaningful.
Yeah, and I'm curious as to how at what point did you start realizing that, sometimes your mental health isn't great, and does music play a role in it?
Yeah, the time when I really knew I needed to sort of take charge of my mental health was when my younger son was very small. And having a baby come into your life, obviously there's great aspects to it. It's also very difficult, and you don't sleep for a while. And that's gonna take a toll on anyone's mental health. But the hope is that you then bounce back from that as you start to sleep more. And that was the thing that wasn't really happening. And it's been a process in kind of noticing smaller changes so that I can make sure that I stay on top of my mental health while it is good, rather than just sort of working myself to the bone or ignoring it and until I'm forced to confront something. Music is great, obviously. I don't know that playing music really is a way that I help my mental health. Sorry, that's a very thinking it out.
No,
I think of what I would have tried to say. I think that the state of my mental health really influences what I do musically. And so when I was not in as good of a place, I wrote a lot of music that's like very still and very spare and very doesn't have a lot of motion in it. And some of that music can be great. And then, as I got into a better space, there's a lot more dynamic music and a lot more sort of athletic music. And that's something that I'm excited to write more of, as I go along. But the album that I'm putting out now it really charts that course. So you see some of the music that's really still and spare, and some of the music that's really dynamic and active and athletic. So I was kind of writing through the process of doing that, of coming back to mental health.
Well, actually, first of all, I want to hear your experience in having your first kid versus your second kid, because from what I'm understanding, your mental health took a bigger toll after the birth of your second child, right?
That's true. I don't know that I would extrapolate that to other people necessarily, or, if I sort of went through it again, it might have been the, 2 kids instead of 1 kid. It might have been specifically the second kid. It might have been just that, anything else that was happening. But yeah, I think having my first kid, there's a dip, which I think anybody who's had a kid will relate to. But it didn't take the same toll that it did the second time. And I don't really know why. I don't think I have any real wisdom to offer from that, except that, it happened the second time and didn't the first time.
Okay. Yeah. No, I don't know, is also a valid answer. But what I was going to say earlier was, I'm curious as to, you mentioned how like, your kids growing up from like ages 0 to 2 years old, they need you all the time. Obviously, that kids need their parents all the time. But did that ever hinder how often you created music, how often you turned to music?
Yeah, there's just not a lot of space for creativity when you have a very small child. There's, you can kind of sneak away and play a little bit, but you just need a lot of focus time in order to create music. And, there's, and I'm not even, I'm not not nursing a kid. I'm not, I don't, there's
Mhm.
ways in which the biology of it, it favors me. But I'm still getting up in the night. I'm still, being,
Mhm.
doing a full-time parenting, really. So I think one of the things that I see a lot of people on, the internet talking about is how historical geniuses, sort of male historical geniuses, always had a woman who was taking care of their whole life, right? And they could just go and work all the time. And that's not a model that we mostly have anymore. I mean, there are some people who have relationships like that, but, I wouldn't want one of those. But you also, when you don't have any time, and I think men and women both have this, where you're kind of jealous of that sort of relationship. Like, wouldn't that be great if I just had someone who could just take care of all the things, and I could just go do whatever your work is, right? Whether that's scientific research or music or anything, because I'm obviously egalitarianism, great, love it, but it means one of the things that you give up when you take on this an equal parenting role is that that time is not available for other things. And so like, I love it and I wouldn't want to change it, but I'm also aware of that time is not available to be creative, and you have to find other time to do it.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And you mentioned, your partner is also in the music industry. So I could only imagine when you're having kids who need all of your attention, there must be little time for either one of you to really dive into music, which is something that is such a shared bond between you two. I can only imagine. So like, I feel like that might have played a really big role in your depression, knowing that like you are able to turn to music. And then you mentioned how you don't necessarily turn to music as a support system, but your music reflects a lot of what you're feeling, which means you do create when you're feeling certain type of ways, whether that's up or down. So not being able to create, it's like journaling, not being able to, it's like for someone who journals all the time, not having that time to journal their feelings can be really, really difficult, because then you end up bottling them in and then they build up. So, I assume double that for you and your partner are both like, who both use music as a means to create. That must have been really, really difficult for you too.
There's just a constant figuring out of, where you are, what you need to do, and where you can find space to be creative.
Oh yeah, that's a learning curve, right?
Yeah, it's been great chatting. Thanks for having me. Definitely want to mention the album if people are curious what the music is like. So the album that I have out is called Say You're With Me. It comes out the 24th of June, which this might air after that, in which case it's out now. The best place to get music if you want to support an artist is Bandcamp, so larkhall.bandcamp.com. If you're into streaming, it's on all the streaming places, so just search for Larkhall.
Lovely.
The other thing I would say is I love when people tag me into things on social media. It makes me feel like I exist in that weird world that we're all kind of half stuck in. So if this resonates with you, or you want to chat, or you want to say what track you enjoy or whatever, I'm on all the social medias as well. You can find me there.
Lovely. And I will be linking your Bandcamp to the description of this podcast. So
cool. Thank you.
Listeners can find you there too.
Excellent.
Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for opening up and sharing. And again, you have such an interesting story and your art is unheard of. So very, very interesting. And I can't wait to see where your art continues to be headed.
Cool. Me too. Thanks.
Have a good one.
Yeah,
Bye.
you too. Bye.